This week, the climate change negotiations start in Copenhagen. Delegations from 192 countries are gathering there to decide what is in store for us for the future. Can greenhouse gases accumulation be reduced? Can global temperature rise beyond 2 degrees centigrade be stopped? This is the question before the Copenhagen summit. The greenhouse gases cause the rise of global temperature. Greenhouse gases are due to human activities of different kinds. Out of this, the CO2 is the most important and also the longest lasting in the atmosphere. It's a rise of CO2 which is causing global temperatures to rise, ice sheets to melt, and sea levels to rise. The IPCC predictions for the fourth assessment period done in 2006 was quite clear. We need to cut global emissions drastically and we need to cut it quickly. The science of this has now reached a consensus and only a few climate change deniers still hold out. 3 years later, the scenario is even worse. We are outside the IPCC's predictions on all counts, whether it is loss of ice, whether it is rise of sea levels, or it is global temperature rise. The CO2 emissions have risen much faster than the IPCC predictions, mainly because the rich industrialized countries have failed to cut their emissions, as was agreed in the Kyoto Protocol. At present, we are about 386 parts per million by volume of CO2, and we can reach a maximum of 420 parts per million by volume if the IPCC predictions are to be kept in mind. This would give us greenhouse gas concentration of about 450 parts per million, which is the red line according to IPCC. With most of the global carbon space already occupied by rich industrialized countries, the developing countries will have to either abort their development or go in for high cost, low carbon path of development. The question is, who is going to bear this cost that is going to be imposed on the developing countries? It is argued that China and India are also big emitters. So if global climate change negotiations has to succeed, then they also need to cut their emissions. This has an obvious problem because the per capita emissions in India are roughly about 1/15 that of the US. So if India is considered a big emitter, the problem that we have is how do we meet the development goals of the people, provide them minimum subsistence level of energy and yet contain carbon emissions. The China has a much larger per capita emission than India. Its historical stocks are far lower than US's, and even by per capita terms, it's only about 1/3 that of the US. Since energy is a measure of a country's development, the question is, how can a country not provide basic subsistence level energy to its people? How can it remove poverty without being able to offer energy to its people? And if it uses a low carbon path, the energy costs are likely to be 4 to 5 times that of using the high carbon path, which was what all developed countries have used till date.
If you look at the total amount of space available to the world for emitting carbon dioxide, then we can think of it as similar to a tank that is slowly filling up with CO2. So if, say, the total amount of space available to us since the Industrial Revolution is around 500 to 640 gigatons of carbon. 500 if we consider around a 75% possibility of staying within 2 degrees Celsius, and 640 gigatons if we consider a lower probability of around 50% of staying within 2 degrees Celsius. Almost 50% of that space has already been used up. We've put out around 330 gigatons of carbon already into the atmosphere. So if we put 190 gigatons more, there's a 25% chance that we'll cross 2 degrees Celsius. The rich industrialized countries, or the Annex 1 countries, have already occupied 3/4 of the total carbon space, whereas with only 20% of the global population. Whereas the rest of the world, with 80% of the population, have only 25% of that share of the carbon space. So if we consider that every person has an equal right to the atmospheric carbon space, then say for instance the United States should have had only 5% of the total carbon space, because it has around 5% of the world's population. But it has already occupied 29% of the global carbon space. And India, for instance, with 17% of the world's population, has only 2% of the global carbon space. Even with extremely steep cuts that the IPCC has recommended, India would still say go up to only 4.5 or maybe 5% of the global carbon share.
Basically, that all the developed countries are trying to rewrite the entire negotiations process. They want to go back to where things were in 1991 virtually. So they are reopening every single major item which is up for discussion. They want to discuss putting developing countries and developed countries together in the same basket. They don't want to fix high targets for emissions reduction. They don't want to commit themselves to substantial fund transfers, and on technology transfer they are absolutely silent. So on all the major issues which were to be discussed here, they are virtually taking us back 20 years. The US, firstly, this is the first time the US is actually coming forward with some target.
We'll establish strong annual targets that set us on a course to reduce emissions to their 1990 levels by 2020.
But the target they are coming forward with is so weak that in the eagerness to get the US on board, everybody else will move towards the weak target. They are offering a nominally 17% reduction from 2005 emissions. Given that the US has already increased its emissions substantially, this amounts to a 3% reduction compared to 1990 levels by the year 2020. That is in comparison with what the IPCC wants, which is a 40% reduction. So we're nowhere near the kind of targets that we're talking about. And if the US sets the bar this low, everybody else will then correspondingly set the bar low as well. Well, one draft has come from the Danish government, which is essentially trying to, as I said, rewrite the Kyoto framework, which differentiated between the developed and the developing countries. The Danish proposal wants to put both these in one basket, not to have targets, but to allow each country to set whatever target it thinks it can, which is very close to what the traditional US position has in fact been. This is being obviously rejected by all the developing countries and several of the developed countries as well. That's one. Then there is the working draft being put together by the negotiating team under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which has been put together after a series of consultations with all the countries. That's the official negotiating draft, which of course contains many options, many bracketed clauses, and so on and so forth. And then there is the third draft, which has recently been tabled, and that's the draft put together by Brazil, South Africa, China, and India. And this draft is in the background of the Chinese unilateral offer of a 40% reduction in emissions intensity, along with somewhat similar offers by Brazil, South Africa, and India. But it lays forward the essentials of sticking to the Kyoto framework. So these are the three major drafts before the conference table. There is now talk that the small island nations may also table their own draft. I think it will be very difficult for the developed countries to totally resist the large number of small island states, least developed countries, the entire African continent virtually, who are going to demand immediate action to rescue them from what seems certain doom. Slightly richer countries will be able to postpone doom by some months, but these countries certainly can't. And I think it's going to be very difficult for everybody to completely write off the pressure from these countries. So I think there would have to be some response to that. My second expectation is that because there are so many political leaders present, heads of government, heads of state, who will again find it difficult to go back and answer to their respective domestic constituencies that they've come back empty-handed. They will have to have some kind of aspirational goals which they can convince people back home that they are moving in the right direction. They are also likely to set some time frame, hopefully. What they are able to achieve in that time frame is what remains to be seen. And on that count, I'm not that optimistic. I don't see these countries actually agreeing to the kind of steep emission reduction targets that the IPCC wanted. But maybe we will reach some lower target, but something to the extent that you postpone doom, but you may not be able to postpone rather severe impact, particularly in the developing countries.